thought it would be useful today to go through a document which is looking at sex and relationships education, and specifically the document's called The Future of Sex and Relationships Education Curriculum in Wales, Recommendations of the Sex and Relationships Education Expert Panel. So this was published in December 2017, and you can go and find this yourself at the on the Welsh Government site. So one of the important things to understand is how education and the way that sexuality and relationship education is being taught is being altered by academics who have been trained in the critical post-structuralist neo-Marxist tradition. And so there's a couple key terms and things in here and a couple key ideas which make it easy to access precisely the intellectual history and why it is linked to that intellectual tradition of neo-Marxism and post-structuralism. And so what we're going to see is a complete reform of how education takes place, but also the ideas and the notion of the child's relation to the teacher, the child's relation to society, and what the purpose of the education is and how it imbues purpose in the child in relation to their identity, specifically their sexual identity. And so this is looking at creating, quote, effective pedagogy and assessment for rights and gender equity-based, inclusive, holistic, creative, empowering and protective sexual and relationship education curriculum, close quote. So that sounds, fairly innocuous. It sounds certainly very positive. Gender equity, so that's complete equality. This is the suppression and removal of distinctions. Inclusive is a process which we can see in Foucault. This is to reintegrate the things that have previously been excluded, inclusive obviously being the opposite of exclusion. But when we take it to the idea of gender identities or orientations and sexualities, what Foucault originally used this for was in his argument to reintegrate the perversions into society. So Foucault saw, for example, law and sex, biology, the sciences. To him, they were just discourses, they're rhetorical games. And he saw this as the imposition of power on society, so people recapitulate those norms once they learn them. And he wanted to undo those, one of those being law. So you say that law is a discourse, it's just an arbitrary power imposition, it doesn't actually attach to any moral principles or reason in society. It's something which can be dispensed with as much as it should, to remove how it's been imposed. So you remove the laws and then you can impose whatever system you prefer in its place. And specifically for Foucault, you want to start to include all the perversions that were excluded in society. So this group has been established by Cabinet Secretary for Education, Kirsty Williams. So what you have here is somebody in government establishes a group, and the group are typically academics, and they take the dialectical ideas which have been developed in the academy, and they report it back to the state. So this is the state mediating its own transformation by the creation of a separate group. The people who populate that group are dialectical philosophers, specifically those in the post-structuralist tradition, and they come back and they tell government, well, this is what you need to do with your policy. So in Scotland, you can see the exact same with ScotGov's non-binary working group. I've done a lecture series which covers a lot of their ideas, their use of Sartre and his concept of lived experience, and then Foucault, his discourses, the contents of which can be Sartrean lived experience, specifically in the realm of sexuality is one particular application. So here we're seeing just a parallel of what's already happened in Scotland. It's fairly straightforward once you kind of get the gist of it. So one of the things that comes out very quickly in their main findings section is that even very young children will be negotiating a range of social and cultural norms on these issues. So they're referring to obviously relationships and sexuality, and then cultural contents on those things. That will shape their day-to-day lives and imagine futures. This knowledge, often termed as the hidden curriculum, can include misconceptions and misinformation. It can also challenge and exceed adult expectations of what children and young people are learning and experiencing. So what's being said here is that ideas and cultural practices are conveyed, or ideas and practices are conveyed through culture, and this can happen at so say for example, you're going walking down the street and there's a billboard and it's got someone who's scantily dressed or doing something which is sexually suggestive. This is exposing society and people within it to essentially sexual information. And as far as these people are concerned, this exposure means that children are sexualized. So this is an argument which is explicitly from Foucault. He saw the family and society as sexualizing the children, and you could argue that really this is a type of projection. It's attributing a sexualizing process to the family and culture, which people like Foucault then use to justify, well, if this process of sexualizing is already taking place, then this sexualization process needs to be done in the correct way. So it needs to be underpinned by dialectical philosophy, and it needs to be underpinned by dialectical ideas. So the idea of a hidden curriculum, that comes specifically from Giroux and a guy called Anthony, I can't remember his last name, covered in my book. But the hidden curriculum is this conveying of cultural norms and ideas and practices that people engage in, the way they see the world, the way they see themselves, their identity, and the moral principles. So this is all a hidden curriculum which is conveyed simply by growing up and engaging in the life process. The children adopt the parents' ideas, mannerisms, practices, and behaviors and things like that. They learn by copying, imitation, emulation. And so here the idea is that there's a hidden curriculum in place which is conveying the wrong ideas, and hence it can include misconceptions and misinformation. So misconceptions mean, the wrong ideas, this is the false consciousness, this is the wrong form of reason. And then misinformation is much more about, it's something which is very favoured among the communists. Misinformation, it's used in order to censor. And to justify then the positive, or to establish the positive case for propaganda in communist nations. So misinformation here is the wrong information on morals and ideas regarding sexuality and families. So here we're seeing it bolting straight into Foucault's project, which he explored in the history of sexuality, particularly Volume 1. So it can also challenge and exceed adult expectations. So that's the wider cultural element. So, there's already a process of sexualizing people, so of exposing children to sexuality and sex. So why not do it properly? This is how these people think. So the idea then becomes, quote, by building upon children and young people's own informal learning and experience, offline and online, schools have the potential to create safe and empowering environments that enable children and young people to express their views and feelings on sexuality and relationship issues. So again, this sounds fairly innocuous, but you've got this broader cultural ideas, the hidden curriculum being conveyed to the children by their parents and the wider culture. But instead of this now being a kind of a natural process, it's looking to turn this into a dialectically informed and philosophical process, which is being then practiced on the body and in society. So the idea is to create a safe and empowering environment. So this actually comes back to Georges Canguilhem, the idea of an organism and its milieu. So the milieu, or its environment, can influence the organism, but likewise an organism will have tools in order to influence its environment. And so you establish an environment where it's now acceptable for children to express their own opinions and feelings on sex and relationship issues. Now, of course, children are naive; they lack life experience. You can express a view on something as a child, but the probability that it will be underpinned by genuine experience and things like this is almost nil, particularly when it comes to sexuality and so on and so forth. So this is explicitly against the idea of childhood naivety or childhood innocence. The idea that there's a real kind of progression and maturity at which certain ideas actually become more acceptable to teach. Versus, and along with protecting children from certain ideas, because early exposure can distort perceptions. They might even start to do things which they don't fully understand the consequences of. And also, when you're a child, it's very difficult to spot, the distinction between when someone's trying to be your friend versus when someone's trying to be your friend but has a more Machiavellian personality type. So they're trying to mimic positive emotions and relationships and establish trust, but this is actually ultimately being used in order to cultivate a relationship whereby a person can abuse you. So that's the process of grooming. So indeed, quote, indeed, schools are key sites for learning from and responding to children and young people's questions and needs. Example, from sexism to sexual consent, close quote. So again, this is the creation of an environment, but the learning environment is now inverted. And so what you can see here is learning from and responding to children and young people's questions and needs. So the idea here is very Freirean. You collapse the distinction between student and the pedagogue being obviously the person who typically does teaching. But in Paulo Freire's system, his critique of the revolution, specifically whether it's the Leninists or even Marx and Engels, was that they, either as intellectuals or leaders, were essentially established within a hierarchy and separate from the revolutionaries. So you want to collapse that distinction and have no distinction between revolutionary leaders and the proletariat themselves. So it's all one entity. And when he extends that to how he envisions pedagogy in the future, the collapse is between the teacher and the student. So the teacher becomes the student, and the student in turn becomes the teacher. So you can think here that the child informs the teacher on how to be taught, or they inform their ideas, and then the teacher, providing the dialectical methodology as per Freire's system, would then help the child to establish their own ideas based on their base intuition. So it's not really an idea of conveying information and facts and principles to children anymore. It's using their base intuitions on the world and their crude ideas, and then to attempt to systematize this and then bolt it into their identity and their worldview. But the idea obviously being is that the more you can understand the things that the children respond to, the more things that you can tap specifically in order to further bolt this education and ideas into their identity and their worldview. So you make it more fundamental to their real sense of self and how they see reality. So you're really trying to tap into their ontology and their view of the world. So when we see this guidance emphasizes children's rights to access comprehensive SRE, so that's sexual relationship education, enabling children and young people to develop the knowledge, skills and understanding to make informed choices that support positive life experiences, including sexual well-being and healthy relationships. Of course, this has got a positive manifestation, because at some point, once you're going through puberty, you are going to need to understand, well, what am I going through? And at some point, you are going to become interested in the other sex. So you are going to need to have information about relationships and so on and so forth. But this is the idea that the child has a right. So this is somebody who has not gone through the various neurodevelopmental stages. They don't have, the fully developed systems of whether it's cognition, memory, and so on and so forth. The brain continues developing. Some studies saying, as late as, the late 20s. So the development of the brain, and particularly with experiences, is a long-term process. But so the idea that a child has a certain right to access education on sexuality and relationships is starting to place the ability within on the child to be able to demand certain things from the state, and where the state establishes this set of premises with the child, the child can then report back. So this has already been, they can reflect back to the state that they have certain questions and needs. They've got things that they need to demand. And one of those is the right to access the information which they desire, irrespective of what age that happens to be. So you see this movement from the state creating a advisory group populated by Foucauldian discourses. The contents of those Foucauldian discourses are Sartre's lived experience, in specifically the lived experience around sexuality. And so you undo the old discourses, and then you establish the new discourses, and you establish new practices and ideas in society. And then instead, here, you've got the movement towards children being, within this discourse, this view of the world, children have a right to access this knowledge. So once you've set up this group of the academics which advise the government, they then say, okay, now we put these ideas into the school, and then the children will themselves advocate and push forward the system of ideas and demand more from the state because it's now a positive right. They have the right to assert their access to sexual education and information, and then the state, of course, responds. And this is how essentially dialecticians establish systems of circular logic where it's always begging the question, it's always the entity using some sort of external group or manifestation in order to then reform itself. It's this organistic self-organization where you're, like Canguilhem, modifying the environment, using the modification of the environment back to modify the organism. Here it's the child and their ideas on sexuality. So when we come to some of the findings and their statements, they say that the current education on sex and relationships is too biological. And the important thing to recognise there is that Foucault, History of Sexuality, he made the argument that sex and sexuality were actually distinct. They were both discourses. And the issue he had was that examining the body as a coherent whole was simply a way of looking at the world through the old system of logic and reason, to assert that biology is what sex and gender are contingent on, is a false way of looking at the world. So when you separate these two, you've then got this aspect of sex and sexuality, which are now free-floating. But of course, once you say that they're discourses, they're just rhetorical games, and you bolt them into the dialectical method that you're always moving forward in history, and you've got a certain way of developing ideas, you say that both sex and sexuality can be reformed as per the requirements of dialectical intellectuals in the academy. So this is where the idea that it's too biological comes from. Biology obviously is a problem if you want to make sex completely free-floating and free-forming. If you want to have certain standards and morals, you've got to get rid of biology. And then too negative. So this is obviously targeting the idea that sexual licentiousness can lead to, and promiscuity can lead to transmission of diseases, illness, and so on and so forth. So it's removing some of the ideas on essentially sexual conservatism, or pair bonding and then staying with that person for your life, only having a very few number of sexual partners and cultivating a relationship and seeing yourself as a team overcoming various issues and helping one another to grow, to become successful in conveying good ideas and morals and practices to your children, and that they can then go on and do the same and be good members of civic society. And so obviously if it's too negative, it's emphasizing too much the restrictions or the dangers of sexuality, and they certainly are. It's not something which should be engaged in lightly. And so not enough focus is placed on rights, equity, emotions, and relationships. So this is the complete inversion. Instead of obviously, so you're removing sexuality being contingent on sex. So that's the first part. So sexuality is purely self-defined by the individual. We now want to make it something that's not negative, but we want to make it something positive. And one of the pathways to making it something positive is emphasizing the rights, equity, emotions, and relationships. So now you examine instead that the child fundamentally has a right to sexuality, and that it's got to be positive. Equity, so that's to equity in this context can potentially mean more along the third category. So again, in my series on queer theory, I explore in lecture across lectures 2, 3, but more specifically in 4, when I'm talking about the ScotGov and their citing of Gilbert Hurd's book Third Sex, Third Gender. It's an alternative category, and what the purpose of the alternative category to male and female, the purpose or the telos of that category is to undo the prior categories. So for example, if you see that there's sex distinctions between men and women, that there's biology associated with this and related to this, and then on top of those you've got the sexuality, so the expression of people's gender and practices, which can vary between cultures. Well, all of that's a system which is bolted in together. What you do is you say that this binary between man and woman, that's where you can have heterosexuality, but likewise between the groups you can within groups you could have homosexuality, well, if you establish a third category, then you dispense with all of that prior system. So equity is the new identity, but which dispenses with the distinctions within and between the old systems. So it's actually a means of getting rid of sexual distinction. So that's the absolute equity that's in there. And obviously the emphasis on emotions and relationships, well, the idea of often in neo-Marxist, the whole thing in neo-Marxism is that you have theory, so you have an idea and you're moving towards a certain goal, but then you have to put it into practice. So you establish an idea of, for example, creating a third category and then using this to change society. And so you've got to put it into practice. You've got to put it into practice in the education system. The children then adopt those ideas, so they have the theory in their consciousness, and then they implement it themselves in society. So here you dispose with the old system, and likewise, it's all centered around, I have a right to do this. It's equity. So you trying to do the opposite is a threat. It's an imposition. And then when it comes to emotions and relationships, then you're denying me the ability to have a relationship. You're denying me the ability to experience positive emotions. So, quote, there is a gap between children and young people's lived experiences and the content of SRE. So what this is saying is that there's a contradiction between the child in terms of the things they have seen or the things that they have heard or indeed experienced, and then the content of the sexual relationship education. And so the problem here that the academics are saying and the people advising government are saying is you need to collapse this contradiction. You want to have non-contradiction between the children and young people's lived experiences and the content of SRE. Now, if you're actually going to enact and integrate the content of SRE into lived experience, this explicitly means that they must then practice those things. That's what that means. So to integrate the content of sexual relationship education into the young person's lived experience, they must physically have lived experience of those ideas. So this is the theory, and it must be put into practice. So it says that current SRE provision is not enabling children and young people to understand and negotiate the challenges and complexities they may face in relation to sexuality and relationship issues offline and online. So again, this is the idea that the child is capable of consent. This is the idea that the child has a right, that they are competent when it comes to their sexuality, and they need to be able to, or they need to be given an environment in which they can negotiate the challenges and complexities that they may face in relation to sexuality. So this is sexualizing the children. This is encouraging them to put into practice the ideas. And then, there is also a gap between what children and young people want to learn and what SRE. So, I mean, it doesn't actually have a citation. So this is obviously just pulled from the arse of nothingness, but it justifies the essentially the trend, the direction of travel in which academics would like to push the idea. This is the self-serving statement that the children want it, so we must give it to them. You can see how this is a reflection of Foucault's ideas. So, quote, there are not enough opportunities for children and young people to influence what they learn in SRE. So again, you create the milieu, you create the environment, and you provide the content then to the child, and then the child repeats back the content. And so it's this leading argument, you provide the information and say, well, what do you now want to learn about now that we've started to talk about sexuality and relationships? What are you, do you want to, or what do you do when the child says that, well, I would like to have experience of negotiating the challenges and complexities that I may face in relation to sexuality, blah, 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 and all that crap. So if you actually provide that system, then you then need to provide the framework whereby children start practicing with one another and negotiating challenges and complexities. Now, that doesn't actually mean physically doing things in schools, but this can be role-playing and getting children to engage in these negotiations and trying to overcome the challenges and complexities of relationships with one another at a young age. So the idea is obviously to get them more and more into not being children, to remove childhood innocence, to remove the idea that there's a certain time when these things should be taught, and to get them practicing sexuality and aspects of relationships more and more at a younger and younger age. So children, young people do not contribute enough towards curriculum development. So that's the free Aryan idea. You want the children to actually be setting the curriculum, its contents, and what's being done based on their naive intuitions of the material world around them, but formed and controlled through the dialectical process. So again, you feed the ideas to the children, they parrot something back to you, then you feed new ideas, or you reform the environment so that they can do something else in the future. And this is the children themselves then defining, okay, well, what do I want in terms of my sexual education, which is completely the wrong relationship. It's adults who have been vetted, who are competent in this area, who recognise the problems of child safeguarding, grooming and pederasty, and who convey the information in the correct way at the correct time. Whereas here you have the complete inversion of that. You've essentially got the children saying, I want the contents of the curriculum to be XYZ. There's obviously going to be problems with this, and then when you throw obviously into the neurodevelopmental issues and things like this, you've really got a complete mess. Awful abuse. So again, now we see quote, SRE is rarely inclusive and too heteronormative, close quote. So that's straight from Judith Butler, and the idea here is twofold. Inclusive is actually from Foucault. That's established in his ideas when he wants to depose law, because he sees law as a discourse. So the contents of the discourse are lived experience and power relations. They're arbitrary, so you overthrow them. Because if you actually have an established norm which everyone must live by, it could only have been put in place by power. So the correct application of power is to depose this and allow everyone to negotiate their sexual relations between them. Obviously here as well, when you're getting rid of the idea of childhood innocence and things like this, then that goes across ages, and we can see how this document as well references, children basically being anywhere between 3 to 16, and later in the document it says, gender identity can start as low as 2. So this is the entire breadth of age development across children. So inclusion, brief digression there. So inclusion is actually from Foucault, and that's his deposing the law, and for him, he was accused of pederasty when he went to Algeria. There's news articles about that, but you can find information all throughout his works where he's constantly talking about subjects such as child masturbation, child sexualization, the perverse, people who are insane, and then basing identity based on madness. And specifically when it comes to sexuality, he did believe that children could have relationships and that they were capable of erotic relationships, because he said that consent is a contractual notion. The child is capable of assenting to the contractual notion. You can find the sources for that in my lectures, again, on queer theory and its development. And then heteronormative, that's more of an idea from Rubin and Butler. So the idea of heteronormative is that heterosexuality, so man and woman, is the norm. As far as they would be concerned, this would be a discourse. This discourse is used to force people into a existing form, and that existing form is heteronormativity, and then the culture and practices and ideas and relationships all associated therewith. So if you want to get rid of the heteronormativity, then you need to also break apart homonormativity, because it's established within the same framework. So you get rid of also lesbians, gays and bisexuals. So I always get confused here when I see LGBTQ+, because lesbian, gay and bisexual, those in the names, you can actually hit, it is sexual. It's based on biology. It's based on the categories male and female and the various interactions that you can get. Transsexual would be implying that you can change sex. Transmorphism would be changing the body. Transgender is to just identify with the notions of gender which are supposedly opposite to the ones that you would be expected to have, providing your sexuality flowed from your sex. And then queer is that which is strange. So you can actually have, there's a definition further down, but queer is the thing which is outside the norm, which is to be reintegrated. So queer, for example, might be that third category. Queer would be the thing which is outside what the society and its discourse says is the norm, and that can go for the plus is almost better seen as a question mark, because, okay, well, what does the plus signify? When you've got these Foucauldian ideas of deposing law because it's a discourse, and then re-inclusion of the perversions, Q and plus become quite a serious problem. But the thing about the Q and the plus is that they're to do with gender, and then sex and gender, sexuality and gender disregard sex as a biological base. So LGB and its attachment to Q plus, it doesn't make any sense to me. It's in the Marxist framework, it's a thesis and antithesis together. So they negate one another, and then out of these two comes something else. So in the concatenation of LGB to T and Q plus, when it's through the neo-Marxist and post-structuralist framework, when it's discourses and lived experiences, this is actually a category itself which represents the process of destroying both groups in order to then sublate out a new form of sexuality, which will then take place in the future. And of course, once you've got the principles of inclusion and the rejection of heteronormativity, you know exactly where that leads, because Foucault, of course, was alleged to be a pederast, and indeed his framework facilitates that. So this is what's in the education system in Wales, but hey, don't be shy, because it's also happening in Scotland and presumably in England as well. So it's not just isolated to Wales, this is taking place across the Western world. And the reason it's taking place across the Western world is because once you teach a certain system of logic and a certain system of values and social engineering, then that process through the academy can go out into teaching of the teachers, and then broadly enter into the cultural milieu, and then reform the society as a whole. So it's not as if it's a conspiracy, it's just once you have a broad enough intellectual movement of people who've got different values and ideas, then they're going to seek to advance their political ideas, and their political ideas happen to be based on the ideas of Foucault, who was a paedophile. And this can be integrated into the education system. So obviously taxpayers' money here is used to indoctrinate the children on their sexuality, and to make it easier for people whose behaviours have previously been excluded by law to then be seen as acceptable and something which is included in society. So once you get rid of the idea that you should exclude anything, well, everything becomes inclusive, and that matches and bolts into the Marxist and neo-Marxist dialectical framework quite nicely, because ultimately you want to move towards the monad, you want to get rid of all contradictions. So at some point the things which are legal and illegal must be bolted together, man and woman must be bolted together, man and animal must be bolted together, so on and so forth, as the dialectical advances, and so on and so on. So this is where we see, that's kind of tapped in quite nicely, because quote, high quality sexual relationship education starts early, is adaptable and needs led. So that's obviously needs led by the children and adaptable to the children's needs. And then quote, offers a spiral curriculum. So spiral curriculum, spiral is non-linearity. So this is a reference to fractals, and specifically it's a reference to the dialectical methodology and logic. So this is the Hegelian system. Specifically when we come to Foucault, it's the Hegelian system after it's been reformed through Karl Marx. So he's got his materialist iteration of Hegel's ideas. So you can see how gender and sexuality, they're rooted in emotional experience, relationships and actions. So this is materialism of it. It would be completely antithetical to the idea that there's a higher relationship above, which is taking place in Christianity. So Christian is marriage as a Christian institution. You're rejecting that, and instead you have a purely materialist view of things, which is very low level and crude, which is to do with intuitions and my rights, my emotions, my feelings, and that's all that's there. So the spiral curriculum is a reference to the dialectical process itself, and at that point you also then have non-distinction between Freire's education system and his goals for education, and what's being presented here by the Welsh Government. The idea in Freire's system obviously being that the pedagogue in the classroom was responsible for ensuring that the dialectical form of logic was the predominant form. You know, you're not going to use analytical reason, scientific method, debate, things like this. What you're doing is you're always bolting things specifically in Freire's system into how to complete God's work. That was his project. So he crashed neo-Marxism into into religion, creating religious neo-Marxism, and then he has a Gnostic knowledge process for generating ideas. That's the dialectical method. You've got thesis and antithesis. You bring them together, and then you sublate out. So you bring the LGBT and the LGB and the TQ plus together, and then you sublate out new sexuality at the end, which is inclusive. So this is the spiral movement over time. So when we come then to the next part, so this is page 8 now. Engaging and participatory, so that sounds horrifying enough as is. I don't need to say anything else. And then create safe. It's always got to be safe. It's always got to be respectful, and it's got to be safe and respectful to the person, because the person has embodied ideas within the Marxist tradition. So you must be safe and respectful of them, and by extension, safe and respectful of their form of logic and the ideas and values that they use to advance their political goals. And then a confidential learning environment. That just sounds fairly disturbing and quite risky, because okay, well, who knows what's going on, who has access to the learning environment, the ideas? Is it the parents? Because in Scotland there's certainly the possibility that children can go through their state sponsored identity formation when they adopt their own names and sexualities, but they do not necessarily have to inform the parents. So the parents could be kept in the dark that this entire program of providing these new categories and identities and these rights and emotions and things that the children can claim for themselves is providing the space that this can happen. So that's the milieu, the environment for the dialectical state-sponsored identity, which is distinct from that of the family. So yeah, confidential learning environment, to me it's fairly straightforward with what's going on there. Got to be whole school approach, so that's the totality, the totality of the local environment, so that's straight out of Sartre. And then supported by external agencies, so that can obviously be charities or people developing or charities and things developing other frameworks. So that could be someone like Stonewall, it could be someone like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or whatever it happens to be. So SRE is curriculum error, often poorly resolved, whatever. There is a lack of awareness and education on violence against women. So this is one of the things that you often see within the dialectical methodology, is it always uses as its crux for social transformation victimhood. And it will always go back to the idea that at a certain period in time, so the present day, because we are not underpinned by dialectical methodology and ideas and values and praxis and consciousness, we have non-equality. So we have the bad kind of diversity. So that's hierarchy and oppression. And so all hierarchy and oppression and all its magnitudes and manifestations are contingent on the present time and the form of logic and values that people use. So for example, if there's in Foucault's ideas, if you've got sexuality as a discourse, then all strife and oppression would be attributed to the period in time where sexuality is contingent on sex. So things like sexual violence are actually a result of heteronormativity, of not accepting queer. It's seen as an extension of not being inclusive. So all kinds of harm and all magnitudes of harm are associated with one another. So you need to get rid of all of them. And so obviously violence against women do not want that. But at the same time, this is being used in a very particular way. There's also a bit of a question mark about it. So here you've got violence against women, but then of course if a person can simply identify their gender as a woman, then it's violence against the person who identifies themselves as they wish. So if you actually operate from the principle which is governing the logic, then it's violence against anyone who identifies themselves anyways which they choose. Woman just happens to be one particular form at the moment, but preferentially that would be expanded elsewhere. So then you can have, so this is key areas and expert panel recommendations. So panel recommend a name change from sex and relationships education to sexuality and relationships education. So again, that's the reference to Foucault. It's distinction of sex from sexuality to then bolt them back together in a different way where they're reformed, so they're only just discourses now. So the term sexuality emphasizes the panel's holistic approach, so that's dialectical, whole world, non-contradiction. as the World Health Organization states, is shaped by the interaction of biological, psychological, social, economic, political, cultural, legal, historical, religious, and spiritual factors. Now, later on, if you go and find that quote, it actually also says that, sex, it says biology is actually in there. Here, that's being occluded. So it's a selective quotation, but which removes the real kind of sexual basis. It does reference biological, but of course that's in contradiction with sexuality as a discourse. It's in contradiction with the dialectical methodology. It's in contradiction with the entire framework of the genders bit. So we understand exactly which one of those two sets of principles and forms of logic is going to lose out in the end. So, and of course, when you're always using violence as the justification for the transformation of society, so you attribute all evil and violence to society of the present day, and you use that in order to reform society and the politics. It's got this puritanism, so any manifestation of any kind of harm to the oppressed group is basically a step on the pathway to their extermination. So there's this real puritanism in the thought, which is that any utterance or any action which is in non-conformity with the prevailing political habitus of the day is, of the dialectician's dialectical framework, that always leads to violence and harm. So instead they, quote, aim to support children and young people's rights to enjoy equitable, fulfilling, safe and healthy sexual lives and relationships over their life courses. So again, we're not seeing really the distinction between innocence and childhood and inability to consent because you can't understand, you don't have the neurodevelopmental framework, you're not mature enough, versus when you are. Here it's over their life course. So the life course doesn't distinguish between these different stages, it's the entire life, and then the healthy sexual lives throughout their lives. And then, of course, this is also enjoy equitable, fulfilling, safe and healthy sexual lives. So again, you can quite clearly see how this is to establish the child's right to a sexual life throughout their life. That's what this is directed towards. That's not a surprise based on what we know about Foucault. So again, here when you're talking about the risks to that, the idea that anyone should reject that sexual identity developing early in life, that would be bullying, that would be harm, that would be oppression, and you would need to remove that. So what you do is, when you've got the third category, which is designed to negate the male and female, the heterosexual and the homosexual, you need to get rid of all of the cultural manifestations, the hidden curriculum that's all associated with them. So here on page 10 is, quote, help challenge gender and sexual stereotypes and advance awareness of sex, gender and sexual equality and equity. And they've got some sort of acronym here, which I haven't bothered to learn. But again, you see the idea is that all of the prevailing norms, all of the prevailing ideas, the way we talk about things, the way we understand ourselves, the way that we enter into relationships and negotiate our relationships, whether it's an intimate relationship with our partner, or whether it's the relationships with family and people in society, you need to be going through these, and you need to find where the gender and the sexual stereotypes are, as informed by dialectical methodology, and you need to destroy them. So you wipe out any reference to the previous sexual order, and you establish this new sexual order. So that's the LGB plus the Q, plus and Q brought together. You destroy everything, which is the set of norms at the time, and then in the future, you've then got this new form of sexuality, where of course you've got the collapse of contradictions, the inclusion, and the non-distinction between different groups. So the recommendations are, they're not going to lead towards a more healthy society, which is going to produce more stable individuals. This is going to lead to more suffering. It's always positioned as freeing and the imbuement of rights, of positive rights. So I have a right to do X and you can't stop me. So this is the person as their own gauge. But quote, to make sexuality and relationships education a statutory part of the new curriculum for all schools age 3 to 16 and underpinned by the core principles in recommendation 2. So if we now go to recommendation 2, So recommendation 2, which I think is on page 15, so that's saying that the core principles are the rights and gender equity, the creative and curious, empowering and transformative. So that's the Freirean pedagogy aspect, the child leading the education, their own knowledge, the modification of the environment and what content can be conveyed to them. So experienced, near and co-produced. So this is one of those terms that you probably kind of look over if you're reading and thinking, well, it's a bit of a strange word, but okay, it's going to be in the classroom environment, but this is experienced, near and co-produced. Co-produced is explicitly a reference to the Freirean system of education because it's teacher and student alternating in their position of who is student and teacher, who is producing the knowledge and the information. And obviously it's got to be holistic, inclusive, blah, 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 and all that stuff. So it's emphasizing, obviously the child's right. So the child is a competent moral agent. They have a right to this, and they have the ability to exercise that right. And the child is allowed to be creative and curious. So it's creating the environment for them to facilitate, this learning. But it's got to be empowering and transformative. So they've got to be in control of it, and it has to actually alter their identity. It has to alter their sense of being and their conception of the world. And it says that it, quote, invites children and young people to advance social justice for gender, sexual and relationship equity and well-being, close quote. So what that explicitly says is that the contents of the education is explicitly political, and it's explicitly political in the social justice tradition. So again, we're looking at the neo-marxism, we're looking at the post-structuralism. The social justice also means it's a moral system bolted into other ideas like global citizenship education, critical race theory and anti-racist praxis, and all of the different aspects of the moral identities that make up the dialectical individual. So that's the experience, near and co-produced is, the children leading their education whilst they're naive. So it's this stupid, cyclical, self-referential system where someone who's not intelligent or who doesn't understand all of the consequences of their decision is actually running their education. So that's obviously going to go horribly wrong. And then it's holistic, so this is interconnecting into society and across all the different aspects of society. So the ideas and practices need to be represented everywhere. Obviously, it's inclusive, so in the Foucauldian sense, you reduce the wrong kind of diversity and you include the perversions back into society. And then apparently it's somehow meant to be protective and preventative, even though you're starting to cut the old society out of education. You're starting to remove parents from being aware that this is taking place if you're in Scotland, for example, and so on and so forth. So obviously this is not going to go right. So when they talk about the holistic side, the whole school approach, quote, the whole school approaches are not just more likely to result in sustained cultural changes at the level of the individual learner, but across school staff and governing bodies and the wider school community. So that says right there, obviously the political ideas of social justice here mediated and adopted by transformation of the identity by providing categories which alter sexual identity, informed by the dialectical process, likewise is bolted into the broader project of the transformation and cultural revolution of society. Here you're looking at sustained cultural changes within the individual, so it becomes a fundamental part of their identity, which then is represented in the politics in the wider world. So first you reform the individual, you get the child, you indoctrinate them with these ideas, and then they go out into the world and then they start spouting them, and then it's also a political community which is oriented around terror and fear at the biology and sex and sexuality connection, because that's inherently oppressive. You want to get rid of those things, and through this, yes, you do change the cultural environment in the school, but you change the cultural environment in the society. You change the civilization from the bottom up with the proletarian child. The proletarian child was an idea of Otto Ruler, and you can see his ideas also in Zev Vygotsky's work if you're interested. That's in part 5 of my book. So yes, you reform all of the educational system and the training itself in line with the new dialectical methodologies. That really is a Gramscian premise. So you can find that in Gramsci. That's ultimately where, after going through people like Sartre, that Paulo Freire gets it. So all people should be intellectuals. So you remove the analytical form of reason and you say that there's not biology, there's not sex, it's just discourses, and this way that everyone's on the same level, everyone's an intellectual now once they're speaking from their intuitions and their base ideas about the world. And so one of the key things that I saw standing out on this page 18.7, all schools should have a specialist trained SRE lead with access to resources and guidance to coordinate a rights and gender equity based curriculum. So this is the technical specialist who's gone through the training, they've gone through the academy, they've got the know-how, they're going to tell everyone how to do it. They are the dialectical wizard who everyone comes to for the knowledge. And I'm just quickly scanning to see if there's anything else I've highlighted. Yeah, okay, so they have a couple of definitions. So sex is used in this report to refer to biological processes and attributes, and obviously not much of this report has actually been focused on sex. It's been focused on the gender aspect. And it says that the attributes that societies use to assign sex categories. So this is a bit of a subtle thing that you probably normally go over, but the idea is that the society and the people in society have a certain consciousness, and that consciousness and form of reason in particular is what governs how they assign categories. And so so sex is one of the means by which society has this discourse. The discourse has these forms, these areas mapped out in it. These are the sex categories, and into the sex categories you've got all these ideas and associations. But it's the society that determines it. So if you can change the form of society, you can change the types of categories used. That's why the emphasis is on gender, because you're not wanting to talk about the sex, the biological. You're wanting to talk about the emotional, the rights-driven, the child consent, the gender stuff, and the gender identities built. So gender is all about, obviously, the body, but then expression on it and what you've attributed to yourself. And then that can include the need to depose the old norms. So that can be part of the gender practice or the gender expression. And yet here, gender identity. So, quote, feelings about gender identity start early, around the age of 2 to 3. Again, no citation whatsoever, but it shows you that obviously it's necessary then to change the education. So you can expect the state to make the framework that prior to the child coming into the school, or as soon as it's going into nursery, it will also need to go through the gender indoctrination process. You know, these ideas of the child being a sexual being from essentially the start of its life need to be began and enforced by the state as early as possible, and that creates obviously the attachment between new state identity, which is distinct from familial identity, and attaches it to the state. So the child sees the state as the arbiter of its social issues, and has to come to the defense of the state if it's going to rely on the state to come to the defense of its rights. So queer is used in the report as an umbrella term to refer to non-conforming gender and sexual identities, expressions, and orientations. So non-conforming gender and sexual identity would be things like cross-dressing, drag, so on and so forth. Expressions, that might be something fairly similar, but orientations can obviously include the excluded, as per Foucault, the exclusion of the perversion. So that's everything from pederasty to bestiality and necrophilia and all of the other kind of things that you would normally see excluded in society. It can include those. That's provided for within Foucault. I think that was everything I saw in this document. So yeah, not too great, but these are the ideas which are established in government, and this is trying to show you how some of the consequences will pan out. The ideas which underpin these movements and why they're doing what they're doing and where they're going. This should all be fairly clear. So if you haven't seen my series on the development of queer theory, it's 4 lectures, but it's 10 hours of material. It will give you a comprehensive understanding of how these ideas are developed. A lot of that's obviously been covered in here, touching on them, but that would be quite useful if you're interested in understanding this topic further. All right, thank you.